Thank you for having me. I'm very sorry that I could not be with you in real time, but I'm grateful to have the opportunity to offer some pre-recorded thoughts on the U.S. and CPEC. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center think tank in Washington, D.C. U.S. perceptions and policy toward the CPEC have evolved to a remarkable degree over its 7 years of existence. Washington's view of CPEC has been shaped to a significant degree by a U.S.-China rivalry that has sharpened considerably over the last few years. Indeed, during the early years of CPEC, when the rivalry was less fraught than it is now, Washington expressed public support for the CPEC project. U.S. policy towards CPEC became markedly more critical during the last year or so of the Trump administration, when U.S.-China relations plunged to their worst low in many years. Accordingly, the Biden administration's policy towards CPEC has been and will be shaped by U.S.-China rivalry. Though President Biden has indicated a desire to seek cooperation with Beijing when possible, when it serves U.S. interests, the U.S.-China relationship is very tense and will remain so. The rivalry is here to stay and for the long haul. This suggests that U.S. views of CPEC are unlikely to soften in a big way in the Biden era. And indeed, there's no indication that they have to this point. But let's now delve into how U.S. perceptions and policies vis-a-vis CPEC have evolved since 2015, when the project was formally launched. Contrary to what some may believe, Washington has not been consistently opposed to CPEC. During the project's first few years, U.S. officials perceived it in a way that Islamabad and probably even Beijing would like Washington, and of course the wider world, to see it today as a promising project that could deliver major benefits to Pakistan's economic development and contribute to its broader prosperity. In October 2017, a State Department official said in a lengthy statement that, quote, CPEC, and particularly its focus on transportation infrastructure and energy development, has the potential to contribute to stability and prosperity in Pakistan and the region. The U.S. welcomes any development projects that benefit the Pakistani people, unquote. That was a statement from the State Department in 2017. Even more striking were that official's comments about China. Quote, we have a shared interest with China in a stable and prosperous Pakistan. China can play an important role in expanding and improving Pakistan's infrastructure and promoting power generation projects. Notably, those comments came just a few months after President Trump had hosted Chinese President Xi Jinping for a two-day summit at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. Soon thereafter, Trump would say that the U.S.-China relationship was enjoying, quote, tremendous progress, and his Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, while announcing a new agreement to expand trade, spoke of the relationship, quote, hitting a new high. Now, just several months after that, Pakistani media reports claimed that then U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan, David Hale, had lamented during a discussion with the Federation of Pakistan Chambers of Commerce and Industry that the U.S. had not been invited to join CPEC. So according to Pakistani media reports, the U.S. ambassador was disappointed that the U.S. had not been asked to be a part of CPEC. But even back then, at the end of 2017, there were several hints of a darkening U.S. mood on CPEC. One of the first signs came in October 2017, when Defense Secretary James Mattis testified on Capitol Hill about the Belt and Road Initiative. He told the Senate Armed Services Committee that BRI, quote, goes through disputed territory, a likely reference to Gilgit-Baltistan or Pakistan-administered Kashmir. He added, quote, I think that in itself shows the vulnerability of trying to establish that sort of a dictate, unquote. No nation, he said, should try to dictate the project. Mattis's comments were notable not just for being the first public criticism of CPEC by a U.S. official, but also for articulating India's position on BRI at a moment when the U.S.-India partnership was enjoying rapid growth. The second sign of a changing U.S. position on CPEC came in July 2018. It came at a moment when Pakistan's economy was struggling and rumors were rife that a newly elected government would pursue a new bailout plan from the IMF. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned the IMF not to provide bailout funds to nations receiving Chinese loans. Quote, there's no rationale for IMF tax dollars, and associated with that, American dollars that are part of the IMF funding to bail out Chinese bondholders, unquote. That's Mike Pompeo. Given the sizable number of CPEC-related Chinese loans that Pakistan was taking on back then, Pompeo's threat appeared to be directed at CPEC. In 2018, US China relations took a major tumble. In March of that year, Washington, reacting to what it described as China's theft of US technology and intellectual property, imposed new tariffs on China. A brewing trade war intensified over the summer. And in October, Vice President Mike Pence gave a policy address that, for the first time, outlined a more hawkish policy toward Beijing that would endure for the rest of the Trump administration. Pence said that the US would compete, not cooperate with China. He lambasted Chinese censorship and religious persecution. He decried Chinese military aggressions in the South China Sea. In 2019, the trade war further intensified. That summer, President Trump imposed $300 billion in new import tariffs and designated China as a currency manipulator. And another ugly war, one of rhetoric, was in full force then as well. It was against this backdrop that Ambassador Alice Wells, the most senior South Asia focused official at the State Department at the time, took the stage for a speech at the Wilson Center on November 19th. It was an event that I organized. She delivered a detailed denunciation of CPEC, a speech that would make headlines around the world and spark angry responses from Beijing and Islamabad. Now, the first part of the speech, the critique of CPEC, generated the most headlines, but global commentary gave much less attention to the second part of her speech, which called for more US investment in Pakistan using a more equitable and sustainable investment approach. Wells's speech was meant to be a critique of China, not of Pakistan. Her framing of US investment in Pakistan as a better alternative to China's amplified how CPEC and more broadly Pakistan had gotten dragged into an ever worsening US China rivalry. In 2020, US China relations really hit a new low. President Trump's blaming of China for spreading the coronavirus pandemic, US policies in Hong Kong, Chinese expulsions of journalists with American newspapers, American assertions about the illegality of Chinese claims in the South China Sea, the closures of each other's consulates, Pompeo's declaration that engagement with China had failed. All of these developments made for ugly, toxic diplomacy. Not surprisingly, there was additional US public criticism of CPEC in 2020. Ambassador Wells remained the chief US government critic of the project, reiterating her earlier concerns about, quote, predatory Chinese lending and a lack of transparency, while also alleging that corporations blacklisted by the World Bank had received CPEC contracts. Furthermore, during the last months of the Trump administration, we started to see U.S. policy directing a more explicit China lens to its policies in South Asia. U.S. officials began efforts to strengthen engagement with the smaller South Asian states to try to wean them away from China and more toward the U.S. and India. One of the very last policy decisions taken by the Trump administration in Asia was to announce the decision to establish a U.S. embassy facility in the Maldives. This all speaks to the increasing concern of the U.S. about China's growing role in South Asia, and for sure in Pakistan through the vehicle of CPEC. Now, some observers from the Republican Party had suggested the Biden administration's China policy would revert to the softer, more conciliatory stance of the Obama administration, in which many of the current government, including Biden himself, had served on senior levels. Pardon me. However, it is quite clear that the Biden White House is no pushover on China. Much has changed in US-China relations since the Obama years, and there is now strong bipartisan support in Washington in favor of taking a strong stand on China. Now, tellingly, many of the top China hands in the Biden administration, including Kurt Campbell, a former Obama official who is the coordinator for Indo-Pacific policy in Biden's National Security Council, many of these top China hands have been described as hawks, not doves, on China. Indeed, the Biden administration, like its predecessor, views Beijing as a strategic threat, particularly because of its continued muscular actions in the South China Sea that threaten the interests of U.S. treaty allies and other key allies in Asia, but also because of a deepening Chinese presence in the Western Indian Ocean region, closer to India, of course. President Biden, who has pledged to make democracy promotion a major pillar of his foreign policy, has been critical of Beijing's authoritarianism, its human rights violations, and its undemocratic uses of technology. The Trump administration's Indo Pacific policy, which is at its root a strategy meant to counterbalance China's growing influence and footprint in the region, this policy has been retained. The Biden White House, from its earliest days in office, has articulated some of the core principles of that policy, such as working with partners in the region to promote a, quote, free and open Indo Pacific, and to use the Quad as a multilateral forum to advance the policy. And of course, there have been a series of new triggers for US China tensions during the Biden administration to this point, from the decision to invite the Taiwan de facto ambassador in Washington to Biden's inauguration ceremony to Nancy Pelosi's decision to travel to Taiwan. What this all suggests is that the Biden administration will continue with the Trump administration policy of opposing CPEC. Many of Wells's criticisms of CPEC have likely found favor with senior Biden officials who hope to promote abroad the good governance, equality, and transparency that Wells had said were lacking in CPEC projects. To this point, though, there have been some differences between the Trump and Biden approaches to CPEC. One is that the rhetoric from Washington about China more broadly has not been as ugly and sharp as it was during the Trump years. And Biden has insisted that he will try to pursue cooperation with China in areas that make sense and serve US interests. He specifically cited public health, climate change, and nonproliferation. So while Biden has continued to promote a hawkish policy toward China, he's been softer in tone than that policy has been softer in tone than it was in the Trump years. And this has allowed some space for looking into engagement and cooperation, including the recent Biden-Xi meeting at the G20 summit in Bali. Not surprisingly, we have not heard to this point Biden administration officials lambasting CPEC with harsh rhetoric. We have not heard the Biden administration threaten to use coercion to undermine CPEC, such as Pompeo's subtle threat to use the IMF as leverage over Pakistan to wean it off CPEC loans. In fact, we haven't really heard Biden administration officials say much at all publicly about CPEC. A good reflection of what to expect from the Biden administration on CPEC, both substantively and rhetorically, came in a speech made by U.S. CENTCOM Commander Kenneth McKenzie in February 2021, soon after Biden took office. While speaking about U.S. competition with China in the Middle East, McKenzie said that, quote, China uses its Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor to expand Chinese influence and presence, unquote. It was a clear statement made matter-of-factly but respectfully that the Biden administration will view CPEC through the lens of U.S.-China geopolitical competition and rivalry. In recent months, we've seen additional indications of how the Biden administration is trying to counter BRI and, by extension, CPEC. It has announced two new initiatives, among others. One last year is something that came out at the G7 called a Build Back Better World initiative, which is meant to mobilize private sector capital for investments in climate and health security, digital technology, and gender equity. Then this year came the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is meant to establish a U.S. blueprint for economic investment in the Indo-Pacific, and it was also motivated by a desire to respond to criticism that the U.S. lacks a core overarching economic policy in the Indo-Pacific. All of this is meant to counter China's investments in the Indo-Pacific and more broadly, by extension, in Pakistan. So to conclude, the Biden administration views CPEC in a similar way that the Trump administration did during the latter period of its term when there was a worsening of US-China tensions. While Pakistan and China may depict CPEC as an admirable effort meant to bring more prosperity and stability to Pakistan by enhancing energy security, increasing employment, and creating more infrastructure, the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, once US-China competition began to play out more intensely, won't see it through that uniquely economic lens and doesn't see it through that lens. As McKenzie's comments last year suggested, the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, perceives CPEC as a vehicle through which America's biggest strategic rival and a U.S. strategic threat extends its influence and clout. The Biden White House's somewhat more restrained policy toward China more broadly does portend and suggest a less overt, harsh tone towards CPEC, but still, At the end of the day, U.S. policy towards CPEC will be driven by the dynamics of U.S.-China tensions. Any potential for a more supportive U.S. position on CPEC would be enhanced by a less tense U.S.-China relationship. The U.S. is not about to embrace CPEC, but if tensions in its relations with China can be ratcheted down to a considerable degree, then it would be more likely to look at CPEC in a more nuanced manner, and not simply through the zero-sum lens of geopolitical rivalry. With that, I conclude and thank you very much for listening. I certainly would be happy to respond to any questions you have. The organizers can tell you how to get in touch with me, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.